What's up guys, today we'll be taking a look at the Gearbox CX11 models, and this might be one of the most highly requested views you guys have asked me for, but it also may have been my least favorite review that I've ever done. So let's talk about it. Unlike the CX14 where there are only 2 models, there are actually 8 variations of the CX11, but they can be broken down quite simply. There are 3 things you need to choose when looking at the CX11s. The first thing you need to choose is which shape you want. There's the CX11E and the CX11Q. The E stands for elongated and the Q stands for quad, which is just a wider body paddle. Once you've decided on your shape, you need to decide between 2 different weights, 7.8 and 8.5 ounces. After that, you're left with either the control or power versions of each model. The control versions are meant to act a bit softer and absorb more energy, while the power series is stiffer and will return more energy. They're all 11mm, edgeless, 3K woven carbon fiber, and the core is T700 carbon fiber instead of polymer like most paddles on the market. There are 2 grip size options, 3 and 5/8 inches or 3 and 15/6 inches, which makes it one of the thinnest grips on the market. If you have small hands, this is awesome, but for most people with average size hands, you're going to find that this grip is very small and you may have to add 2 or even 3 over grips to make it comfortable for your hand. The only difference between the CX11Q and the CX11E models are handle length. The CX11Q is 4.75 inches, while the CX11E is 5.6 inches. Because of how Gearbox paddles are constructed, the weights are almost always dead on as well. I think 6 out of the 8 paddles I weighed were exactly as advertised. The ones that weren't were only off by 0.1 ounce, which is far better than the variance you find in polymer paddles. Gearbox is one of the only companies that has been this consistent with the weight of their paddles, which is awesome to see. Also, one thing I want to know is I've seen a lot of people online say that Gearbox handles aren't an octagon, and I don't know where that comes from because at least if you just look at the handle and feel it, it's pretty clear that it's an octagon. Now, normally I save durability towards the end of my review, but with Gearbox, you have to talk about it first. If you don't already know, most pickleball paddles have a polymer core. With Gearbox, the majority of the paddle is made of carbon fiber. It's not entirely made of carbon fiber. People have corrected me on that many times. Thank you to those who have mentioned it. So yes, it's not entirely made of carbon fiber, but the vast majority of it is, and makes it very unique from most paddles on the market. There's also no edge guard, which is usually a massive failure point for most paddles because the glue eventually comes undone and you start to lose performance. If you're looking for a paddle that will essentially never die on you, then Gearbox is by far your best bet. The only thing I would consider doing is adding some electrical tape around the top of your paddle to prevent the carbon fiber from getting scratched. Now yes, some people have managed to damage or break a Gearbox paddle, so they aren't truly indestructible, but in the pickleball world, these things are absolute tanks and so much more durable than any other paddle on the market. When it comes to spin, things are a little bit interesting. When the CX11 first launched, they shipped with very little to no grit on the face. This is because the majority of spin from Gearbox paddles comes from their hyperbite technology. They claim that the ribs inside of the core bite into the ball and help generate spin as you brush up. In my testing, this has shown to be incredibly effective. The first 8 CX11s they sent me all performed very similarly, and the difference can probably be attributed to shape, weight, and swing weight. But recently, Gearbox has silently added a new texture to the face of their paddles that make them much more gritty than they ever have been in the past. Unfortunately, I have not been able to get my hands on the new grip versions of the CX11 or CX14, so I'm unable to provide you RPM numbers, but if I do get them, you can be sure to check my spin spreadsheet in the description, and I will make sure that the updated numbers get posted there. Also, there have been rumors floating around that the CX11s don't have the new grit and that it's only the 14mm, but my contact at Gearbox has told me that both of them do in fact have the new grit. The only downside to all of this is that you cannot guarantee that you will get one with grit. This is because there's no new model or indication that it has the grit. So your best bet to get one would be to buy directly from Gearbox because they are more likely to have gotten rid of all their old supply compared to other online retailers. Throughout my testing, I found the sweet spot on the CX11s to feel below average. I constantly felt that if I didn't hit the ball square in the sweet spot, that the ball was going to immediately die. I'm not sure I would say it's as small of a sweet spot as the 002, but it does remind me of that, where the ball loses significant amounts of energy when you don't hit it right in the center. This was most noticeable to me on drops and hands battles at the net. The ball feels like it dies and makes a very clunky feeling when you hit off center. During my testing, this was extremely frustrating and made playing with the paddle really annoying. Most of my complaints with the sweet spot were in relation to the elongated models. When I started trying the CX11Q, I found it much more enjoyable. It's either more in line with an average sweet spot of a polymer paddle or just a little bit below average. So the sweet spot on the 11E I absolutely hated, but on the 11Q it was much more tolerable. Another thing that makes Gearbox so unique is the swing weight. Many people talk about Gearbox paddles feeling incredibly fast at the net, even the 8.5 ounce versions. This is because the swing weight of Gearbox paddles is much lower than other paddles on the market. To give you a bit of reference, the lowest swing weight paddle I have ever tested, which just means that it's very head light and very easy to swing, was the ProKennex ProFlight at 89. A more typical wide body paddle is around 100 to 110, while an elongated paddle is usually between 110 and 125. The Ben Johns Hyperion CFS, which is one of the most head-heavy paddles on the market, comes in at 127. All of the CX11Q models have incredibly low swing weights. They're all 100 or below, which translates to the paddle feeling very head light and fast to maneuver at the net. I haven't used a paddle this head light in a minute, and it was kind of amazing how fast my hands felt using one. For the CX11E models, they're also very low, but as expected with a longer handle and face, they are higher than the wide body paddles. The highest swing weights came from the 8.5 ounce versions, which is unsurprising, but even at 8.5 ounces, they were only around 113 swing weight, which is very low for an 8.5 ounce paddles. So despite being that heavy, these still feel incredibly easy to swing. This also goes into another interesting thing that I try to tell people about paddles all the time, is the weight is not the only metric you should be basing your paddle purchase off of. I understand that companies don't advertise swing weight at the moment, but an 8.5 ounce Ben Johns feels drastically different from an 8.5 ounce Gearbox. So it's not just the static weight that determines how easy or hard the paddle is to swing, it's about where that weight is distributed in the paddle. On a Ben Johns Hyperion, the weight is all shifted towards the head, but in a Gearbox, it's shifted towards the handle. One of the primary differences you'll notice when picking up the power or control models of Gearbox paddles is that the control versions are more balanced towards the handle, while the power versions shift the weight towards the head just a little bit more. There's still more head light than a lot of elongated paddles, but just be aware that the power models does move that weight up a little bit. And this makes sense because usually with more mass in the head, you can hit the ball harder. So all of that to say, these are very easy paddles to swing even when you choose the heaviest option. We'll revisit this a little bit later because I think it explains why the paddles perform in certain ways. When it comes to power, this is one area that I feel Gearbox really lacks in. Despite having power in some of the model names, if you compare the CX11 to other common power paddles such as the Electrum Pro 2, Selkirk Power Air, or Head Radical Tour Co., then in my opinion, the Gearbox doesn't even rank in a power paddle list. Even the CX11E 8.5 power, which should be the hardest hitting version that they have, really doesn't hit that hard. I think another interesting attribute about Gearbox paddles is they lack pop. A lot of times with the Power Air or Head Radical Tour Co., I feel like I could just hold my paddle in place and let my opponent's power do the work to get my ball back in play. But with Gearbox paddles, they have so little pop that I felt like I had to do a lot more with my body in order to get the ball back over. When it came to drives and overheads, I felt like I had the least amount of power I've ever had before. In my opinion, one of the reasons I think these lack power is because of the low swing weights I was just talking about. Like I mentioned previously, usually once an elongated paddle is getting up to 8.5 ounces, the swing weight is 120 or higher. These are much lower at around 113 and 100 for the 7.8 ounce models. A higher swing weight often translates into a paddle feeling more powerful because there's more mass behind the ball. So once you combine an 11mm thickness with a low swing weight, I think what you're left with is something that doesn't feel as stable and requires your body to do a lot of heavy lifting to generate power. To me, it's really just a combination of a lot of things that don't work that well together. When you compare the control and power versions of the CX11 paddles, I think the difference is subtle, but it is there. The control versions feel a little more muted or dampened, and the power versions have just a tiny bit more pop and oomph behind each hit. I don't think the difference is massive though, and I believe there are a lot of players in the market who may not even be able to tell the difference without very extensive playing. Because of everything I mentioned in the power category, I think these paddles are much more suited for control because of how much they require your body to do. On my drops, I felt like I had to lift with my body more to get them to follow the same trajectory as other paddles that I'm used to. One thing I will say is that while the spin is awesome when hitting the ball harder, I did occasionally find that backhand slices or forehand roll dinks, the paddle didn't grab the ball nearly as much. This is likely because for the hyperbite technology to activate, there needs to be a harder force that makes the ball sink into the face so that those ribs can grab the ball. And when you're dinking, there's just not a lot of force behind it, so the ball probably doesn't sink in as much to hit the rib. Now, this might be completely improved on the new grip models, but of the ones I have, I did find that to be noticeable when compared to raw carbon fiber paddles. Now, while I did really dislike my time with the CX11E, I did actually find that I enjoyed the CX11Q 7.8 ounce control quite a bit. Usually I'm not a fan of wide body paddles with a short handle, but it felt so easy to maneuver and placing the ball felt considerably easier than the CX11E. I also just found that the slightly larger sweet spot on the CX11Q made the paddle much easier to play with. So the most common way you'll probably hear someone describe the feel of a Gearbox paddle is that it's like hitting a plank of wood. While I think that statement is a bit aggressive, I think there are some cases where it's relatable. The feel of these paddles is very different from polymer. The ball doesn't pop off the face as much, it feels very muted and dampened, and the edges are not alive at all. It really is an entirely different experience from a polymer paddle. It's hard to describe, and the best thing I can say is to just go out and try one if you can, and you'll quickly understand what I mean if you get to hit one side by side with a polymer paddle. Because of all the issues I've described, like lack of stability, sweet spot, and power, I decided to try a bunch of different lead tape configurations. The nice thing about these Gearbox paddle is because of their low swing weight, you can add quite a bit of lead tape to customize the weight and balance how you want. Unfortunately, even after trying various amounts of lead tape at the throat, sides, and head on the CX11E, I was still incredibly frustrated every single time I went and hit this paddle. The main CX11E that I was using was the 8.5 ounce control. Almost every other paddle I try these days is improved with lead tape, even if I didn't like it stock. But with the CX11E, no setup that I tried made me enjoy the paddle more. My complaints about sweet spot and power still remained. For the CX11Q, I added 3 strips on each side from the throat up the side of the paddle. I did this mostly to add a little bit more weight without sacrificing hand speed and also to help with more stability. While not a massive change, I do believe it made the paddle a bit more enjoyable to use. I did not end up adding lead tape to the head for additional power because I didn't want to increase the swing weight more because the low swing weight was one of the reasons I was enjoying the CX11Q to begin with. I'm not gonna lie to you guys, in my time reviewing paddles so far, this is probably the least enjoyable one I've had to do to date. At least when it came to the CX11E. I so badly want to like these paddles because I think Gearbox is doing a phenomenal job of pushing new technology that no one else is even close to doing. But every time I went out to use the CX11E, I genuinely hated it. If you ask anyone who was around me while I tested these paddles, I pretty much just complained the entire time I was using it. Power felt lacking despite trying multiple lead tape setups, even on a CX11E 8.5 power, and the sweet spot was infuriating. The edges of the paddle felt completely dead to me, and when I went back to my 003, it was like a giant breath of fresh air. Honestly, it didn't even matter if it was the 003, just going back to a polymer paddle felt like a giant breath of fresh air. The face felt more alive, there was more pop, the face felt more consistent, it was just all around more enjoyable to use. When the 003 and Power Air came out, people kept asking me if they felt like gearboxes, and after using the CX11s extensively, I can confidently say that I don't believe any of these new models from Selkirk resemble a gearbox. The Power Air might be the closest thing to a Gearbox, but the consistency off the face and power is far better than any of the CX11s I tried. Now, while I did end up hating my time with the CX11E, I actually did find that I was enjoying the CX11Q Control 7.8 ounce. This was really odd to me because it goes against most things that I want in a paddle. This one was light, wide, and a very short handle, and it's 11mm thin. What I found I ended up enjoying was with the short handle, the paddle feels more connected to my body, so resets and drops at the net felt really nice. The paddle just felt like a small extension of my arm. After trying another paddle shortly after with a 5.8-inch handle, I felt like I had less control over my drops and the paddle as a whole. It took a few balls before I was dialed back in and felt like I had the same control that I was used to having. I think much of the reason I ended up enjoying the CX11Q so much more than the E was the fact that the sweet spot was better. Like I said, when you miss the sweet spot, the ball is completely dead. So that was less of an issue on the Q than it was with the E. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that Gearbox paddles are objectively bad, minus maybe the sweet spot. But I really just think they don't fit my playstyle. Gearbox fans are some of the most loyal people you will find in the sport, and if you check out the Gearbox forum on Facebook, you'll see hundreds of people who absolutely think the CX11 and CX14 are the best paddle and everything else is junk in comparison. I honestly won't be surprised if I get a bunch of Gearbox fans in my comments telling me how crazy I am for not liking these paddles. And there's nothing wrong with liking these paddles, but the reason I mention that is because I think it speaks to the fact that these paddles can be very polarizing. You're either going to hate them or absolutely think they're the best thing in the game. Unfortunately, I think I fall into the camp where it just doesn't work for me. So if you're interested in hearing from people who love their Gearboxes, I would recommend checking out the Facebook group in the description, and you can get a lot of valuable information about how to set one up if you choose to buy one. But there you guys go. That is my review of the CX11 line of paddles from Gearbox. If you enjoyed, make sure to click the like and subscribe button, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.